Recently, we have started pumping out more and more videos. While this is good for you guys, it does mean that our video editors have to put in more and more work. As such, we are looking for volunteers that are punctual and willing to put out at least one video a week. If you're interested, just leave a comment or contact us on our public Discord, which is linked in the description. Where other countries would see wars between dictators they should not support, the defense industry saw business. And man, business was booming. But how did a country which did not have an established arms industry become the hot new kid on the block? To find the answer, we shall take you to Brazil. Welcome to a new Tank Encyclopedia voiced article. I'm your host Mark, and if you like our work, please consider subscribing on Patreon or donating on PayPal. All of the funds gathered there are used to pay for the amazing illustrations you see on our website and in our videos. Every little helps. Brazil was a country of opposites in terms of armoured vehicles during the Cold War. It went from a country completely dependent on imported equipment to a country that managed to build its own main battle tank, which was able to compete with the established industries of the time in a span of less than 20 years. In 1984, the Brazilian arms export reached its peak, and it seemed that Brazil had cemented its place as an important player in the Third World arms export industry. The difference between the import and export periods can be divided into two periods. The first period takes place between 1945 and 1967. During this period, the Brazilians acquired predominantly American tanks and armoured vehicles through Lend-Lease and the Military Assistance Program MAP. Although essential for the experience, modernization and army structure, for future national armoured vehicle development, it was absolutely detrimental to any initiative meant to start an armoured vehicle industry. At the end of this period, the first minor attempts were made at building and converting some vehicles. The second period takes place between 1967 and 1989. During this period, the Brazilian defense industry was born. From a humble beginning by the army, not long after, companies like Engesa and Bernardini took over. Brazil marketed itself as an exporter for third world countries, and did so with great effect. The Brazilian defense industry would reach its golden age in the 1980s, when it would develop its first main battle tanks. At the same time, the first signs of its impending collapse would begin during this golden age. For this video, we will go through the first period and talk about the first advancements made by the army in the second period. For the second video, we will go through the so-called golden age of the Brazilian defense industry and the most important companies involved. If you are mainly interested in Engesa and the Osório main battle tank, you will have to wait until part 2. Brazil during World War II. Unknown to many, Brazil participated in World War II on the Allied side, sending an expeditionary force of about 26,000 men to fight in Italy, known as the Smoking Snakes, and participating in the Battle of the Atlantic. This participation is an interesting one, as Brazil at the time was a semi-fascistic state which fought for the free world of democracy. Brazil's participation did have a very pragmatic nature though. With Brazil's participation, they would get cheap Lend-Lease equipment, industrial growth with American support, and the Americans helped Brazilians in founding a modern fighting force. This pragmatic nature would become the undoing of the semi-fascistic state under Getúlio Vargas. Fighting alongside the Allied democracies put Vargas in a difficult position, and his previous protectionist strategies did not bring the economic growth which the more open economy during World War II brought. This, among other circumstances, would cause the army to eventually force Vargas to step down. His popularity would not die though, and he would even become president of the now democratic Brazil from 1951 until his suicide in 1954. Equipment and Institutes of the Brazilian Army 1945 to 1964. After the Second World War, Brazil's armoured forces consisted mainly of American vehicles acquired through Lend-Lease. Brazil took a pro-American stance during and after World War II, at first to gain economic growth and equipment to match Argentina's army, but later to become an important participant in the geopolitical scene as well. At the end of World War II, Brazil had acquired a wide range of armoured vehicles, consisting of M3 Stuarts, nicknamed Perereca, a Brazilian tree frog, M3 Lees, M4 Shermans, and M8 Greyhounds, among other vehicles. The M8 Greyhound, although small in numbers in Brazil, was arguably the most influential vehicle for future developments of the Brazilian arms industry, followed by the M3 Stuart. The M8s would form the basis of Brazil's future 6x6 wheeled vehicle projects, and, with the help of Bernardini and Bezelli, a completely new family of vehicles would be designed on the M3 Stuart chassis. With the arrival of these armoured vehicles, a large array of institutions would be created like the IME, the Institute of Military Engineering, in 1959. These institutions solidified the use of armoured vehicles in the Brazilian army, and laid the foundations of the first research institutions for armoured vehicles. Through the Military Assistance Program of the United States, Brazil would also acquire the M41 Walker Bulldogs, M113s, and the M108 SPGs, among other vehicles. The M41 was the best tank that Brazil owned at the time, and they owned, for South American standards, a sizable amount of 353 M41 Walker Bulldogs. The M41 was a sign of great power in South America at the time, which even helped to even out the balance of power between Argentina and Brazil. The M41 was, like the M8 Greyhound and the M3 Stuart, a very influential vehicle in the Brazilian armoured vehicle industry. Bernardini would later update the M41 to the M41B and M41C standard, and the Tamoyo MBT would share many of its components with the M41. The M41s, like many other Brazilian vehicles, never saw actual combat with the Brazilian army. The coup d'état of 1964. The democracy of Brazil between 1945 and 1964 was anything but stable. Brazil was being led by increasingly left-wing politicians, which was not in line with the staunch anti-communist stance of the Brazilian armed forces, among others. The last democratically elected president of that time was João Goulart. Goulart, as a left-wing politician, had radical and communist policies. Some of his policies were to strengthen ties with communist countries, even though he was almost removed from the presidency by the army. His attempts to improve the economy were radical, and included agrarian and urban reforms. During these 3 years, from 1961 to 1964, an anti-Goulart conspiracy grew within the army. And with the announcement of urban reforms in 1964, which circumvented the Brazilian Congress, the first civilian protests began. On March 31, 1964, General Olímpio Mural Filho ordered his troops of the 4th Military Region moved from Minas Gerais to Rio de Janeiro and deposed Goulart. The army and its tanks moved to the cities with the resources of the military, but also with civilian means. The army fueled up at gas stations and used civilian trucks to transport food and fuel. This was the largest logistical operation ever conducted by the Brazilian army, which forced its soldiers to take part in real situations instead of exercises. The logistical operation is still studied and used as an example by the Brazilian army as a result. Tanks and armoured vehicles were stationed in Brazil's most important cities as a show of strength against the Goulart loyalists. The tanks were stationed for about a week, and the crews practically lived in them during that time. Tanks like the M3 Stuart, M4 Sherman, and the M41 Walker Bulldog were transported to Rio de Janeiro, Brasilia, and Recife to defend important locations in the cities and ward off any engagements. None of the other Brazilian armies decided to intervene in support of Goulart, either joining the 4th Military Region or staying more or less neutral. The result was that Brazil was not plunged into civil war. The coup was successful, and an authoritarian military junta would rule until 1984, ending the democratic period of 1945 to 1964. The rise of communism in Brazil was prevented, and Goulart fled the country. The first steps. In the second half of this period, between 1945 and 1967, the first attempts were made by the Brazilian Army to develop and build its own armoured vehicle, and to rearm a single M8 or M20 and an M3 Stuart. These projects were the result of the institutions created during and after the Second World War, and would hail the rise of the upcoming Brazilian armoured vehicle industry. The VETE T1A1 Cuchilla. Brazil's first attempt to develop its own armoured vehicle for the army started in 1958, when 9 students, led by Major José Luís de Castro e Silva, started designing a vehicle based on the French VP-90. The students built a mock-up, and a single prototype was delivered in 1965, designated the VETE T1A1 Cuchilla. The Cuchilla did not perform sufficiently well during trials, and the reconnaissance vehicle was rejected. Although the Cuchilla itself was not a success, it was fundamental in the cooperation between the Brazilian Army and the Brazilian automotive industry to build it. This cooperation between the two would later return during projects like the EE-9 Cascavel and the X-1 Pioneiro vehicles. The M8 rocket launcher projects. From 1966 to 1968, another institute called the Army Research and Technical Education Board, known in Brazil as the DPET, initiated the development and construction of an M8 or M20 prototype armed with rocket launchers. DPET was responsible for the coordination between the Institute of Military Engineering and the Research and Development Institute. The IME was responsible for the training of military engineers and researchers, and the development of new technologies which could be used in the future. The Research and Development Institute was responsible for the research and improvement of systems, equipment, components, materials, and assisting in the development of military equipment. DPET would be responsible for the early prototypes of, for example, the EE-9 Cascavel, EE-11 Urutu, and the X-1 projects. Under the supervision of DPET, either an M8 or M20 received a new turret built by Arsenal de Guerre de Urca. This trapezium-shaped turret mounted 2 sets of 7 individual rocket launchers, 1 set on each side. In 1966, the IME created another M8-based rocket launcher. The IME removed the main gun and gun mantle and replaced the main gun with a machine gun. 2 indigenously built rocket launchers were mounted on the turret, 1 on each side. The rise of Brazilian armoured vehicle industry. There were various reasons for Brazil to start their own defense industry. The main reason was American involvement in the Vietnam War. As the US got increasingly involved with the Vietnam War, the supplies to less important countries decreased. Weapons and tanks which were previously available in large numbers for bargain prices were now getting increasingly hard to get and increasingly expensive. The equipment flow to third world countries was decreased, and to Brazil as well. In addition, during the 1970s, the US would make arms deals even harder because they refused exporting to Brazil because of the human rights violations that the military junta in Brazil was committing. This was a serious issue for Brazil, as the lack of equipment undermined their power projection in South America. Brazil's pro-American stance from 1940 until 1967, and its dependency on American equipment, had turned them, in the eyes of other South American countries, into an American proxy state. With the US pulling the plug on the military assistance program, the political position the Brazilians found themselves in was precarious at best. Without US support, they had no effective army to fight a prolonged war, and with them being seen as an American proxy state, no real influence within their supposed sphere of influence. In 1967, the Brazilian army had conducted a study which resulted in the Triennial Plan 6870. The army recognized the external dependence for material as a serious problem and advocated the need to encourage the R&D of the employment of military material. These factors culminated in the Brazilian breakaway from an import-dependent country and, in military terms, made the country more secure, as Brazil would not be dependent on external suppliers anymore. Between 1968 and 1972, the import of military equipment was shifted from the US to Europe. These imports consisted of a large number of licensing deals, which would eventually enable Brazil to produce their own equipment. From these factors, it can be concluded that the Brazilian defense industry did not start with export in mind, but as a national security project. PQR-MM2. The Regional Motor Mechanization Park of the 2nd Military Region, known in Brazil as the PQR-MM2, was a group of Army automotive engineers, gathered to study, develop and produce armoured vehicles in Brazil. Created on December 17, 1957, the PQR-MM2 engineers were the pioneers of the Brazilian defence industry, and would develop the first prototypes of the successful EE-9 Cascavel and the EE-11 Árduo armoured vehicles. Although the Army had recommended the research and development of military material, the engineering team had humble beginnings. Internal setbacks and a lack of support, materials and plans would prove to be the main difficulty in the early phases of the project. The project consisted of 3 phases. 1. Refitting current vehicles in service with new nationally built engines. 2. Create ties between commercial companies and the Army to develop new vehicles, the design of wheeled vehicles, and the creation of a commercial section. 3. The research and redesign of tracked vehicles. First phase. After the initial difficulties of the PQR-MM2 were overcome, they reached their first success in refitting the engine of an M-8 Greyhound. They refitted the M8 with an OM321 6-cylinder 110 horsepower diesel engine, a new transmission, new differentials and new brakes, all produced by Mercedes-Benz Brazil. The Army tested the vehicles and the results were positive, as the refitted M8 Greyhound performed better than the original. With these results, the DMM, Directory of Motor Mechanization, ordered the refitting of various half-tracks as well. Although these successes are quite small in the grand scheme of developing and setting up a defense industry, they were essential in giving Brazilian engineers confidence in their abilities. These successes paved the way for PQR-MM2 to start with Phase 2, the development of their first wheeled armoured vehicles, and the basis for the future EE-9 Cascavel and the EE-11 Árduo. With the successful refitting of the various vehicles the Brazilian Army owned, the engineers of the PQR-MM2 set off developing wheeled armoured vehicles. The first step was creating the Armour Research and Development Centre and partnering Army project centres with companies that were interested in participating in the Army projects. Among these companies, the most well-known were Avibras, Bernardini, Engesa, Motopesas, and Nova Tração. The basis for this second phase was a study conducted by the General Directorate of War Material. This study analysed 4x4 and 6x6 vehicles used at the time by, for example, the United States, the United Kingdom, Belgium, Switzerland, the Netherlands, and Italy. The results of this study were passed on to the General Provision Department on September 15, 1967. The document called for intensive adoption of wheeled armoured vehicles for Brazil's mechanised units. These vehicles would require a relatively modest investment for their development, and as such would be more viable to develop instead of importing them. The study proposed the creation and adoption of a vehicle like the M8 Greyhound, but simpler. One of the issues the PQR-MM2 team struggled with was money. During the second phase, the engineers created a commercial wing to the park to fund their projects. This commercial wing fixed engines for the private sector, and, at their height, fixed around 300 engines per month. The commercial park became quite lucrative, and all the money made fixing engines was reinvested into the PQR-MM2 projects. The second phase resulted in 3 wheeled vehicles. VBB-1. The Viatura Blindada Brasileira 1, or Brazilian Armoured Car 1, was the first nationally designed and built wheeled vehicle of Brazil. The development of the VBB-1 started in 1968 and ended in 1970 with a working prototype, The issue with the VBB-1 was that the Army did not want it. The Brazilian Army wanted a 6x6 vehicle, not a 4x4. VBR-2. After the rejection of the VBB-1, the PQR-MM-2 started developing a 6x6 vehicle that the Brazilian Army wanted, the Viatura Blindada sobre Rodas 2, or Wheeled Armoured Car 2. The team realized they needed a better suspension for the 6x6 vehicle, and this is when Engesa comes into the picture. Engesa supplied the project with a staple mark of the Brazilian wheeled vehicles, the boomerang suspension. The boomerang suspension enabled the vehicles to have constant traction with the ground. The VBR-2, at this point redesignated as the Carro de Reconhecimento sobre as Rodas, CRR, or Wheeled Reconnaissance Car, was accepted into service, and a contract between DPET and Engesa was signed for the construction of 8 vehicles. These vehicles were again tested, and with the approval of the Army, the CRR received yet another designation, the Carro de Reconhecimento Medio, CRM, or Medium Reconnaissance Car. The CRM entered serial production in 1975 as the EE-9 Cascavel, named after a rattlesnake, which was manufactured by Engesa and would become Brazil's most successful armoured vehicle. CTTA. Together with the start of the VBR-2 project, the Carro de Transporte de Tropas Anfibio, CTTA, the Amphibious Troop Transport Car project, was initiated. The CTTA was meant as an amphibious APC and, in its first stages, was armed with a small machine gun turret. But the project in the form of the CTTA would not be finished. Engesa and the Brazilian Navy later began a new project and started developing the Carro de Transporte sobre Rodas Anfibio, CTRA, or Wheeled Amphibious Troop Transport. When the CRTA prototype was built, it was exhaustively tested between 1971 and 1972 and was subsequently approved. The new vehicle was redesignated to the EE-11 Urutu, named after a South American venomous pit viper, in 1973. Third phase. With the success of the projects of Phase 2, the PQR-MM2 started the development of a national family of tracked vehicles, later known as the X1 family. Instead of developing their own armoured vehicles, the team opted to upgrade the M3A1 Stuart. The Stuart had limited performance for various reasons, but with 300 Stuarts available for conversion, it was a good option to upgrade Brazil's current tank fleet. VBC CC MB1 LAG, X1 Pioneiro. The CPDB, which was created in the second phase, was responsible for the creation of a new tank family and tanks in general. The first step for the CPDB was to select a new engine for the M3 Stuart-based tank family. All the potential engines were too large to be fitted in the M3 Stuart in its current configuration. As a result, the hull was lengthened and a different suspension was adopted. The Scania Vabis DS11 256 horsepower diesel engine was selected as the main engine for the Brazilian tank family. After the engine was selected, the project went to the next step of rearming the Stuart. As the Cascavel was already armed at the time with the French Defra 90mm D921 gun, this gun was selected for the X1 Pioneiro. The X1 was built with help from Bernardini and Bizelli, with Bernardini focusing on the turret and suspension, and Bizelli on the hull and engine. In addition to the X1, a bridge-laying X1 designated XLP-10 and a rocket launcher X1 designated XLF-40 were developed as well. VBC CC MB1A LAG, X1A1 Carcara. The X1 had various issues which would lead to several modifications in the form of the X1A1. This vehicle was also known as the Carcara, a type of indigenous crested bird. Somewhere between 1973 and 1976, an X1 hull and turret was lengthened, among other changes. The X1A1 was not a successful tank. It was very hard to steer, which could only be fixed through very extensive changes. As a result, the Brazilian army and Bernardini started developing the X1A2 instead, Bizelli having quit the X1 and X1A1 project around 1975. The team of PQRMM2 and Bernardini went on to develop the X1A2 between 1976 and somewhere around 1978. Of the three X1 tanks with the 90mm gun, the X1A2 was the only one that did not have an M3 Stuart hull as a basis, but was a national design. Since the X1A2 did not use an M3 Stuart hull, the X1A2 became the first serially produced tank that was fully designed in Brazil. The X1A2 project was cancelled in favour of the M41 modernisation, which was also carried out by Bernardini. After the completion of each of these projects, the respective vehicle would be carried over from the Brazilian army to the participating private company. Engesa inherited the EE-9 and EE-11 vehicles, and Bernardini inherited the X1 family and M4 Sherman projects. From the start of the defence industry, the companies had made a gentleman's agreement not to meddle in each other's speciality. Bernardini specialised in tracked vehicles and upgrade packages for these vehicles, and Engesa focused on wheeled vehicles. In the early 1980s, the Brazilian government released requirements for a national tank weighing 35 tons, which would result in 2 main battle tanks. This was the first time where Engesa trod into Bernardini's territory, and the first time the gentleman's agreement was really broken. Ironically, the Brazilian defence industry collapsed not long after the main battle tank projects failed, as one of the many reasons why the industry collapsed. Another interesting thing was that, even though the Brazilian army had developed much of the prototypes, the defence companies now produced and sold them, and the army did not have any rights to it. As a result, the Brazilian army would not make any money with the sale of, for example, an EE-9 Cascavel, which caused the Army Technical Development Institutes to be horrendously underfunded compared to the private companies. 4 Brazilian companies led the Brazilian defence industry when it came to armoured vehicles and other land-based systems. These were Avibras, Bernardini, Engesa, and Motopesas. Brazil now had its own defence industry and more confidence in its army. Brazil did not need the United States as a patron anymore. With the military autonomy it gained, Brazil essentially stood alone to provide its army with military equipment. This boosted the Brazilian defence industry, but also encouraged companies like Engesa to expand and start playing a significant role in the Third World arms export industry. With the end of this video, the writer would sincerely encourage everyone to take a look at the article itself, as it provides a much more complete and extensive overview of Brazil itself and its projects, companies, and institutions, which were either undertaken or created at the time, which were impossible to cover in this video. Please subscribe and follow to see more videos by Tank Encyclopedia. You can find further information and many more articles on our website. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Reddit. We also have a link to our Discord community server in the description if you want to come and talk to us. If you would like to help us to continue and refine our work, please consider donating on Patreon or PayPal. All of the funds will be used to enhance and design new articles and features for you. From Tank Encyclopedia, this is Mark, signing off.